Hello, hello. Good evening, everyone. Somebody could just say something in chat, hey, let me know you can hear me. Since it is the first event of the day, I did set up a little bit more time in the beginning, so we'll start the presentation a couple minutes in, probably around 7:05. Welcome, welcome. Hopefully everyone's excited to learn about the tools and processes for actually attacking systems. I find them pretty interesting. Test, test, test. Just testing my volume. Hopefully everyone's had a good Saturday so far. Hopefully the Try Hack Me rooms that I gave yesterday, they shouldn't be too difficult. So let me actually check the leaderboards currently, see if anybody else has done any of them. Okay, Dan, looking good. Dan and F Muham 4. Hopefully we'll see a couple more people get some more points on here. It's like Night is starting to do some stuff. The video on the page helps. Oh yeah. For which one are you talking about? I think there was, which was the one that I did yesterday. So there was two of them. Let me remember which ones they were. Yeah, so the basic pen testing. So that one was not really intended for you to go through very far. So pen testing fundamentals was the one. I don't think this one has a video. Pen testing fundamentals and introduction to, dang, I don't remember what the other one was. I have to look it up. It's one of the old videos. But It is 7:05, so we'll go ahead and get started on our presentation. Close that out. All right, so we're going to be talking about a tool called NMAP. So I'm fairly certain this stands for network map, or network mapping, but it's a very popular tool used to map out networks. So this doesn't just include it. It can detect if hosts are up. So whenever I refer to a host, I mean like any sort of type of computer, whether it be Windows, Mac, Linux. So it can detect whether hosts are up or down. It can detect which ports are open, and it can detect what services are running on those ports. It can also run scripts to check and see if there are possible vulnerabilities. It can automatically run those scripts whenever it detects, say for example, there was the Eternal Blue exploit, very very popular exploit, and when on Windows, basically it would, I believe it has to do with the directories, like sharing Samba directories through Windows. So basically what it would do is it can automatically run a script whenever it detects that certain ports are open, and it'll tell you like, hey, this is probably exploitable, probably vulnerable to Eternal Blue, which was a common thing back then. So in order to understand how NMAP works, we need to sort of understand a little bit about networking. So in networking, there are two ways of sort of checking a port, or two types of connections that can be made to ports. There is TCP and UDP. The most common type of connection you're going to be making is a TCP connection. UDP connections are pretty rare, so we won't go over them too much. Attacking UDP connections are pretty rare, so we won't be looking at it too much. But so I'd like to explain a little bit about how TCP works. So as you can see in the image, when a normal TCP connection, say you need to send some data between a computer and another computer, a client and a server, the first thing that TCP will do, it'll send what's called a SYN packet, or a synchronized packet. This will send the server some data and be like, hey, are you alive? Like, are you responding to connections? On this synchronized connection, on this synchronized request, if the server is actually up and running, it will respond with a SYNAC, which is a synchronize and acknowledge. So it'll respond with the data with, I believe it'll respond, with the sequence number that was sent in the SYN message, and then it'll reply with an ACK of the sequence number plus a 1. It'll be responding, in this example it uses im instead of in. So so whenever it gets the synchronize from the initial connection, it'll send a sequence package, a packet with a sequence number in it, and then whenever it returns back, it'll send a synchronized packet and an acknowledgement packet. Like there'll be one whole package, with the synchronized being a new number in, and responding with the ACK, which has the sequence number im plus 1. So whatever was in the initial synchronized request. And then, in order to complete the handshake, the client will get the SYNAC packet back and look at it and be like, okay, so it looks like it's up and running, and the data that we got back is valid. So let's go ahead and we will send back an ACK to let the server know that we are connecting, that we would like to complete our connection. So this is what is called a three-way handshake. This is the most common type of handshake you'll see, um, and it just for any sort of application that uses TCP. If you need to transfer data, this is how it would start the connection. And then after this is done, it gets I'm not really going to explain it because it's a bit out of the scope of this, but it'll start sending data. Right after this, it'll be able to send data back and forth on that same connection. But this is intended to verify whether a computer is responding on a port. So I do want to show a Wireshark example. So a Wireshark is a popular tool used to monitor traffic. You can download it on Windows, Mac, Linux. It reads all of the data that's coming in and out of a particular network interface on your computer. And in this case, they were able to actually look at to actually minimize all of the data that's going around to just look at the initial handshake connection. So they can reduce it down to a specific IP address, source, and destination, and the reverse, obviously, because it's being sent back. And you see right here, you see on the first one, the mouse cursor isn't showing, unfortunately. But you have the SYN on the first. Let me get out of full screen, it'd be a little bit easier to do. So on this first connection, you see that there's a SYN with a sequence number of 0. Like we were saying initially, the source is like the person who's connecting from and the destination who it's connecting to over TCP. It's synchronized with sequence number 0. And then the server from this destination back to you with the TCP connection, you have a SYN ACK packet with a sequence number of 0 and an acknowledgement number of 1. So this acknowledgement number would be the new in of the server, whereas this would be M being sent back. Other way around. So the M would be the sequence number 0 here on the first packet. The N would be the sequence number on the second packet. The M+1 would be this ACK. And then the N+1 would be this this ACK. So this would be telling you the three-way handshake, this final packet here, sending it back to the destination server, is this final ACK packet with both the sequence numbers equal to 1, the sequence and the ACK number equal to 1. So this is a common three-way handshake in Wireshark. So how does NMAP check if a computer is running? Well, we can detect if a port's open with TCP, just like we were just showed you, but how do we detect if it's running? Well, there's a couple of different ways. And the easiest way, most of the time in pen testing, this will be the first way that you check. You can give NMAP just a list of IP addresses, and it will go through and send what's called an ICMP packet. I won't explain what that is, but basically it's a packet that expects a response of a similar type. So Linux computers by default will respond to ICMP packets, but actually by default, Windows computers will not respond to ICMP. So if you try, if you ping a computer, so if I go, let me switch over to the screen. So if I ping, let's say, let's just ping this address, something on my network. So what these are doing are sending ICMP packets. You see it has an ICMP sequence number, and then the computer will automatically respond with another ICMP packet responding to that same sequence, giving you the time and everything is So whenever you do this, this uses ICMP. Now you can, if you're using, if you try to ping a Windows computer, usually it will not respond to something like this. Now you can use other ways or other types of packets to get a response from the computer, but generally ICMP is the way to go when you're dealing with Linux computers, which is what we'll be focusing on. So let me go ahead and switch back to presentation. So one issue that you might have is, say that you know for a fact that this window computer that you're trying to enumerate the ports that are available on is, you know for a fact that it's up and running, but sometimes NMAP will tell you, hey, this computer is not running, it's not responding. In which case you can disable it with a dash capital PN to disable that. A lot of corporate networks will also block these packets, these ICMP packets going through the network. So you may have to, again, use other methods that are a lot slower, such as going through and trying to complete a three-way handshake with every single IP address on the network, which can be very time consuming. So here's some common NMAP flags. So the first example that I showed you is what's called a TCP connect scan, where you're trying to complete a full three-way handshake. But I want to see what. Let's see if we can get some answers in the chat. Do you think that there is a part of that handshake that is unnecessary? If you're just trying to check whether the computer is up and running or not, what do you think is not necessary in order to check if that port is just open? See if anybody can give an answer. Wait just a minute for the stream to catch up. I know the stream is catching up, but a hint is there's 3 different types of packets being sent back and forth. There's one packet that is not necessary. Yeah, we could ping first, but we're trying to check ports. Ping will only, we're not talking about whether or not the tools should be used first. If you're trying to ping something, that will only check whether the host is up or down. With NMAP, though, we can check whether a port is open or not, which is more important than just detecting whether a computer is up and down. Command without act to the server. No, this is very low level. So think of, this is before you can send a command of anything in TCP, you need to have this connection, this handshake going on. So this is required before you can send anything to the server. But of those 3 connections, one of those is not actually necessary to detect whether that port is open. So if you're sending a request to check if a port's open and that synchronize, and then you get a response back that says, okay, I acknowledge that this port is open and accepting requests, and then you respond with an okay, NAC. I'll assume that here you just mean ACK. So in that case, you are correct. Correct. So the final connection is not necessary. So if we're just trying to check if a port is open and available, then we only need to send a synchronize, and then we need to check if we get a response from that synchronize. Now, a lot of in a lot of corporate infrastructure, if it sees a scan going through and completing three-way handshakes between all of the ports trying to complete three-way handshakes on a lot of ports on a server, um, then it'll be like, okay, wait, this is not right. They should not be trying to connect to every server doing a three-way handshake. Um, so let's block them. And so that's an easy way to get blocked on what's called an IDP, or an or IDS, sorry, intrusion detection system will a lot of times block that. Now, modern IDSs can also block SYN scans, and I'll explain what a SYN scan is in a second. But generally, older IDSs do not automatically detect SYN scans that are going through and trying to detect a bunch of ports. So, what is a SYN scan? Well, as I said originally, you don't actually need that third connection. What you do is basically you send a SYN to the server, and then you wait for a SYNAC, and then you just send reset. So you don't need to handle acknowledgement, you don't need to increment the sequence numbers, because the sequence numbers don't actually, in reality, they don't start with 0. There's some randomly generated number. So you just, instead of replying to the SYNAC, you just send reset. Just say, yep, I'm done, reset the connection, I'm not sending any data. Now, modern IDSs can easily detect this, because if you're just going and sending SYN packets to a whole bunch of servers and then immediately sending reset packets, that's a pretty obvious that you're just trying to enumerate ports. But generally, this is going to be a more successful scan, and they actually call it a stealth scan. It's not stealthy anymore because, like I said, modern IDSs can detect it, but it's what's called a stealth scan, and it doesn't actually send that third packet, which also increases the speed by a decent amount. UDP scans, I'll go over those really quickly. UDP scans are very slow. I won't be explaining UDP too much, but in UDP there is no such thing as a three-way handshake. UDP, you send the data, and if it accepts it, it accepts it. If it doesn't accept it, then it doesn't accept it. You don't know. UDP assumes that whenever you're sending something to a port, it assumes that it's open and accepting data. UDP is much faster in when you're doing things that are very low latency, such as gaming or video streaming, where you don't care about the quality of the data, you just care about it getting to it fast. This is where UDP comes in. But whenever you're trying to detect whether a UDP port is open, it's very inaccurate and it's very slow. What you do is basically attempt to send some data to every single port of the computer. And then if it doesn't reply, then it might be open, it might not be open, because, well, it doesn't have to reply. If it replies with the data, though, that could mean that it's open. If there is a server on the other side that does actually respond to UDP data, then you know that that port is open. If it replies with an ICMP packet, then it is closed. That is the standard way that's the way UDP is supposed to handle closed ports and filtered ports by firewalls, is it's supposed to respond with an ICMP packet, but that's disabled for obvious reasons. There's no real reason for you to have that, so a lot of systems just disable it by default. Check if there's any questions real quick. All right, let me go back. So the last two things here are just some common things that I usually use when I'm executing my commands. My NMAP commands is s-sc, which automatically runs scripts on the system to see it's not running scripts on the system. It's running scripts at the system to see if they respond in a certain way that might indicate a vulnerability. It's pretty rare, but the overhead for running scripts is generally not super high. And if it does find something, it's very helpful. And then dash SV basically says, hey, tell me about this port. Not just what ports are open, but tell me about the port um, and what may be running on it. So I usually will run those two together. So an important, just knowing that the ports are open generally isn't enough information. Now there are programs that run on standard ports. For example, SSH pretty much always runs on port 22. Web servers pretty much always run on port 80 and port 443. DNS servers run on port 53. And if you do this enough, you'll learn a lot about what's running on what ports. But generally, a lot of times there will be stuff running on non-standard ports. So sometimes you might see an SSH server that's running on port 2222 instead of 22. That's not uncommon. So, how does NMAP actually get these service versions? If you're trying to manually look at if you're trying to manually look at a specific system and you want to see what's going on with it, you may try to actually connect to a port. And it's actually pretty easy to check which what's running on a service. Most of the services will tell you. Just like if you walk up to somebody and say, "Hi, what's your name?" They'll usually respond with their name. A lot of services do this by default. Most, if not all, services do this by default. And so I'll show you how we can actually take advantage of this. Well, I won't be showing you how to take advantage of it. I'll be showing you how NMAP actually does it. So let me go ahead and switch over to my other screen. Clear this out. So there is a program called Telnet. Telnet, you can also use Netcat is another popular one. Basically, these are very, very low level programs that all they do is complete a TCP handshake. So they just go and complete a TCP handshake with the system that you're trying to connect to and see what happens, see what responds. So in this example, I'm going to be testing a server that I have running in my network, and I'm just going to connect to the SSH port. So if I let me get the IP address of it really quickly. 195. So if I telnet to 192.168.10.195, I already know that port 22 is open for SSH. So if I tell it the IP address and the port, we'll see, wait a second, ignoring this error, it gets this back. And what does this tell us? Well, this tells us this is running OpenSSH 8.4 P1 on Debian 5. So you can use this information and look up, is there a vulnerability in OpenSSH 8.4? Well, currently there's not, because currently there's not a known vulnerability because it's the latest version of OpenSSH. But, in the future, say if this version was never updated, then you may see an issue where, there's a vulnerability that's found in this version and you can go and attack it. So that is how NMAP checks if there's a vulnerability. Now I do want to show you a really quick NMAP command just so you can see how it's run. NMAP -SV-SC is my most common. Now the -SS, this is assumed by default. If you don't define -ST or -SU, then it's assumed to be -SS for stealth scan. And 99% of the time, that is perfectly fine. So I just run a -SV-SC, and then the IP address of the computer. So I believe, which it was 195. And for keeping, making it run a little bit faster, I'm only going to enumerate service versions. It was 195. Let me make sure of that. Yep, 195. So while this is running, does anybody have any questions? So usually take a minute to run. All right. So as we can see here, there are three things running on here. We have port 22 TCP. We have an XRDP server running. So we have an RDP server and an SSH server running. So we have RDP server on 3389. That's the default port for RDP. And port 22 is the default port for SSH. And then RPC bind, I believe that's for RDP. It's a way to communicate with RDP, sorry. Because whenever it makes a request, it needs to send things over RPC. So this is just an RPC server basically running on there. And it's pretty common to see these on 111. It's also pretty common to see multiple RPC binds. RPC bind is usually not exploitable though. So if you do see that, I wouldn't dig too deep into it. RDP, there are usually a lot of vulnerabilities in RDP, so it's usually worth checking. Now RDP by default does not tell you the service version, but there are actually pretty easy ways to get the service version. So yeah, let's switch back over. So this is my final slide. There is a room, I've also linked it in the description, called Further NMAP. It will teach you, it'll go over a lot of things that we discussed already. It will also talk about ways to get around modern firewalls, and it'll tell you a little bit about script scanning, and will sort of give you a little bit more well-rounded idea, as well as get you to be able to practice the things that I've taught today. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask. I'll be sticking around for another 5 minutes, and then we will be moving to our next presentation on introduction to the next presentation is introduction to PHP and directory enumeration. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. I will also be available this evening after our final presentation to ask questions. I'll be in the Discord server, so if you don't get the chance to ask now, you can definitely ask. Ask then. Yes, you can use NMAP and terminal on Mac. Um, you need to do you do need to install brew. If you go to brew.sh on in your browser, it'll show you how to install it. But you just do brew install NMAP, and it'll get it installed for you. Terminal I am using. The default terminal is pretty boring. You can still do all the stuff that you're doing in here on the default terminal in Mac, but I am using something called Tabby, Tabby. It's a cross-platform terminal emulator. It works on Windows, Mac, and Linux, and it's a very beautiful terminal emulator, and I really like it. So, highly recommend. They feel like really nice looking terminal emulators. All right. I'll be sticking around for one more minute. And real quick, that command was brew install NMAP. If you have brew. And then here's the homebrew page. You just execute this command and it'll install brew for you. All right. Well, if anybody has any more questions, you can feel free to come in after our final presentation. Otherwise, I will see everyone at 8 o'clock for our next presentation on PHP and directory enumeration. So I will see everyone there.